Coming to America is a 1988 romantic comedy starring a young Eddie Murphy, well on his way to becoming a superstar, and directed by John Landis. The two had previously collaborated on the 1983 comedy Trading Places. In the intervening years, Eddie Murphy's star had grown significantly, while Landis's reputation was in shambles after the deaths of several actors on the set of the Twilight Zone movie. The result of this collaboration is a movie with an A plot and a B plot so distinctive that sometimes it feels like you might be watching two separate films. Landis's movie is a romantic comedy in which Murphy plays Akeem Jaffer, crown prince of the fictional African nation of Zamunda. Akeem has wanted for nothing his entire life, and his lack of autonomy is already beginning to grate on him when, on his 21st birthday, his parents introduce him to his arranged bride-to-be.
The cooking, the pampering, the dressing, the bathing. Actually, I'd rather enjoy the bathing, but just for once I would like to cook for myself and take care of myself, dress myself, wipe my own backside. And why? Why can't I find my own wife?
Determined to choose his own wife, Akeem runs away to America with his companion Semi, played by Arsenio Hall.
I want a woman that's going to arouse my intellect as well as my loins.
Where will you find such a woman?
In America.
Akeem and Semi move to Queens, New York, disguise themselves as poor students, and begin their search for a woman who will love Akeem for who he is, rather than his wealth and power. After a few less than promising starts, they attend a Black awareness rally, which is where Akeem first sees Lisa McDowell, played by Sherry Headley.
The children are our future. And that's why it's up to all of us to provide a place where children can express themselves. We need to rebuild Lincoln Park. Now, ushers are passing through the aisles with donation baskets, so please, give all you can.
Lisa is the responsible older daughter of local businessman Cleo McDowell, who owns a McDonald's ripoff called McDowell's. Seeing her speak with passion and gravitas about the importance of supporting Black community, Akeem decides this woman is his future bride and takes a janitorial position at McDowell's to get closer to her. What follows is a classic prince disguised as pauper love story.
You know, you're a very unusual guy. I've never seen anybody take so much pride in mopping a floor.
He who would learn to fly one day must first learn to stand and walk. One cannot fly into flying. That is not mine, that is Nietzsche's.
See, that's what I mean. Most of the guys who work here don't go around quoting Nietzsche.
Akeem must woo Lisa while hiding his true identity from her. Lisa has to choose her love for unimpoverished former goat herd, or so she thinks, over the expectations of her family, including her father and her unapologetically materialistic younger sister, Patrice. As far as they're concerned, her current boyfriend, Daryl, the wealthy young son of a hair product dynasty, is an ideal romantic match. Landis's film is a classic Hollywood romance, one that he insisted was colorblind, despite its almost entirely Black cast. But that was not Eddie Murphy's vision, and by the late 1980s, Murphy had the star power to vie with Landis for control of the film. He had also devised the story and owned the production company that brought it to Paramount. The B-plot of Coming to America is composed of sketch-like comedic scenes centered around the other residents of Queens, like the local barbers or a good and terrible soul singer, many of whom were played by Murphy and Hall in elaborate prosthetics. So, should we even be talking about Coming to America as a rom-com? Today's guest, Racquel J. Gates, argues that if we do, we might just be missing the point. Racquel is an associate professor of film at Columbia University and the author of Double Negative, The Black Image and Popular Culture. In that book, she revisits several pivotal Black films through a critical lens that puts aside respectability politics and questions of how Black characters are represented in film in favor of attention to the film industry and the politics of labor, such as Murphy's vital role in the production of Coming to America. But There's a reason why a rom-com was the ideal vehicle for a rising star like Murphy to smuggle in the kind of comedy he was more excited about making. Romances, after all, are about community and relationship. And while Akeem might have come to America to fall in love with a woman, the film invites its viewers to fall in love with what is specifically Black about the characters and the comedy that he meets along the way. I'm Hannah McGregor.
I'm Racquel Gates.
And this is Hot and Bothered. Welcome, Racquel. We are talking about Coming to America, and I am so delighted to be making this episode with you and talking in depth about this fascinating movie.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to chat about it. I'm really excited.
This was my first time ever watching Coming to America. And I had one really big takeaway, which is that I had not realized how much of the culture I have consumed is referencing this movie until I watched this movie and was like, oh.
It's so long lasting, and the way that it reverberates throughout popular culture, I think is really astonishing. It doesn't really get the credit for being the kind of seismic cultural text that I think it really clearly is.
Yeah, and I want us to talk more about that, but I want to start by just hearing a little bit more about your relationship to this movie. Like, when did you see it for the first time? And maybe how did you come to write a whole chapter in a book about it?
Yeah, I actually saw this movie in the theater with my mom. So that was my first experience. And so I remember we went to the theater, you know, on the south side of Chicago, and the theater was packed. And what's been interesting is that I realized when I was writing the chapter that so much of my memory is like I can vividly remember what was happening in the theater at various moments. I remember how the audience responded, and that it feels like a nice kind of gift to carry on from that experience.
I feel like so many of us who went on to become really interested in like reader response and reception theory had these like formative experiences of like, oh, culture is more interesting when you consume it with other people.
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, it's why I insist in my classes, like, we have to screen stuff together. Like, you can't go off and watch a movie on your iPhone and then come back and we talk about it. We have to have the experience of viewing together. And for me, I think as a scholar who is first and foremost a fan of film and television, there are ways that I see a film, especially like a film like Coming to America, being discussed that I usually have this moment of disconnect where I'm like, no, I don't think you're getting it. I don't think you're getting at the thing that audience that I was in, you know, what they experienced. And so that usually becomes a jumping off point for me to sort of begin some kind of scholarly investigation, which is part of how I ended up writing an entire chapter about this film. But the chapter really started as I want to talk about Eddie Murphy playing Saul, the elderly Jewish white character in the film. And I wanted to talk about the white face and the makeup and what that says about whiteness and race, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I went looking for scholarship about the film, just assuming that because it was such a big cultural text and because like everybody references it, like I just knew someone had written a book or there were chapters or something, and I couldn't really find anything. There's lots of stuff about Eddie Murphy, but there's not a whole lot about that movie. And it was one of those moments like, okay, I guess I'll write the chapter about Coming to America. and that's
fine. I guess I'll do it.
So yeah, so that's how that happened.
Yeah. And I feel like one of those sort of big people aren't reading this the way that I experienced it, and thus I want to intervene points with Coming to America is its positioning as a rom-com, which is, you know, why we decided to do an episode about it.
Right.
And then I was really interested to read you saying, like, actually, you're misreading this movie when you read it as a rom-com. So can you tell us a little bit more about, like, how it fits and doesn't fit into the genre category that much of this podcast is about?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because when I started doing research about the film and I was reading film reviews that were coming out at the time of its release, and they were all like, this is horrible, you know, this is bad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of the things that they cited were from like what we would call the A plot, you know, the main romance that kind of animates the story. But my experience, having seen the film a million times, having talked about the film with people, having seen the film cited, is like no one seems to care about the A plot. Like, no, that's not like a thing for folks. And what people tend to cite and what they tend to remember and what they tend to reference are all the things in the B plot, all of these moments and these vignettes that, quite frankly, don't really move the story along very much. They like there's so much stuff in Coming to America that when you go back and rewatch it, you realize like you could just cut all this and it would mean nothing, right? If Akeem never got his hair cut, like that, the barbershop is not really crucial.
Nothing narratively important happens in the barbershop.
No. And that's traditionally, I think, in romantic comedies, how the B plot functions. There's always kind of like, you know, the supporting characters and they provide the comic relief and they, you know, they're kind of the funny people, you know, in contrast to the romantic leads. And so I was really kind of intrigued by the fact that the film critics were judging this as a straight up romantic comedy. But with Coming to America, the thing that I find really interesting is that you have Eddie Murphy and Arsenio Hall playing like literally everybody in the movie.
Yeah.
And so you don't have that same distinction between the A plot and B plot because it's just Eddie Murphy everywhere.
Yeah, so the desire to say like, oh, here's the sort of quirky character actors off on the side doing comedy bits that are sort of not important, but like keep the energy up. Like we can't distinguish that because the quirky character actor and the romantic lead are literally the same person. I want to come back to talking about the B plot, but I'm going to move us through some of that A plot because for better or for worse, it's the A plot. And we're gonna talk a little bit about sort of what the romantic comedy part of this movie has to say about, you know, what stance it takes on romance. And then I'm going to bring us back to your book. And we're going to talk more about the B plot and we're going to talk more about Eddie Murphy because boy, was I interested to read your celebrity study of him. Oh,
I think at some point I'm going to teach an Eddie Murphy class. I say it every single year. I'm going to teach an Eddie Murphy stars auteur class and we're just going to move through like his body of work. But okay.
Yes. Love it.
So A plot.
Okay. So we're going to start off with the question just at the textual level. What does this movie have to say about love?
What this movie has to say about love is that love should be about two people who genuinely connect and are not burdened or blinded or influenced by money and privilege and status.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a classic. Prince disguises himself as a pauper because he wants somebody to see him for who he really is. And at a base level, it's like wealth and privilege block you off from the world in such a way that genuine experiences of human connection become almost impossible.
I would also say that there's a critique in the film of the ways that wealth and privilege prevent you from finding true love, but also prevent you from having kind of the joy of like quotidian experiences.
Yeah.
It's very much like Audrey Hepburn, Roman Holiday. You know, what would it be like if I could just live like a regular person? And the film was marketed that way, to be really clear. I mean, they talked about it as kind of like a classic Hollywood royal in disguise type of film.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting to learn from your writing that John Landis, the director, really insisted that this was a classic Hollywood romance that had nothing to do with blackness.
This is not a black film, like over and over and over again. Yeah, this is not a black film.
Over again, which is, I mean, obviously like profoundly rooted in anti-blackness and the idea that a black film can't be universal. And also like a wild misreading of his own film.
Well, what I think is really interesting is that, I mean, I say this in the book, but I really think you have these two films in one because there's the stuff that's absolutely the kind of classic Hollywood, colorblind 1980s. And this is coming like right at the end of the 1980s. But, you know, that type of thing. I mean, it's that. Can
we pause on that? Because I think listeners might not have that. You know that thing where we both teach in classrooms. We know that for some people, the 1980s was an extremely long time ago.
Yes, that's true.
So what's the context of race politics in the 1980s in which, like, particularly in which a movie that opens in a fictionalized African kingdom,
right?
It seems very rooted in his character being from Africa and then him moving into a neighborhood where he was predominantly meeting Black Americans.
Right.
So what's the 1980s context in which one might read this as a race-blind movie?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple of 1980s contexts that we have to kind of bring in to understand what's going on in this film. And so one, in the 80s, we've come out of the 1970s. Like the 70s are when Black film like saves Hollywood. Black cast films, like, they do. They save the studios. They save Hollywood. And once the U.S. economy and the film industry get back on their feet, and this happens like cyclically, it's kind of an annoyingly cliched story. Like we're done with the Black stuff then, and we go back to making these predominantly, white cast films. But what's interesting about the 80s is that Eddie Murphy becomes a superstar. And so what you find is this kind of like tokenism where he's a star, even if Black films are not necessarily being pushed by Hollywood. Now, again, there's like a robust independent Black film movement that's happening at the time. But in terms of sort of Hollywood film, we don't see the numbers of Black cast films in the 80s that we saw in the 1970s. The other thing that's happening is the kind of logic in the film industry in the 80s has shifted to this kind of big concept film where you have like this one sort of interesting concept that then you just kind of repeat ad nauseum in the film. And so it's like Jaws, which is a fantastic film, but it's like there's a shark. The shark's trying to kill people. That's the movie, and like that's the whole thing. Crocodile Dundee, I think, is another good one from the 80s. It's like, what if you took this dude from the Outback and you threw him in New York City and hilarity ensues? Like that's the entire movie, and every single gag is kind of based off of that. So I think it's important to set that context up to understand, okay, so now we have Eddie Murphy, biggest global box office star. He's got a reputation for having, I think unfairly, for having an entourage and being, he's young and he's rich and he's successful and all this stuff. Yeah. There's a lot of coverage of his personal life. There's a lot of coverage of his celebrity. He talks about it in his stand-up. You couple all of that with Hollywood's sort of emphasis on this single concept film, and you get Coming to America, which is in so many ways also like a referendum on Eddie Murphy, like the star trying to date in real life, which is the other thing that I think kind of makes it like fun, because it's really a fictionalized version, I think, of his experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting, because that sense of trying to find connection with somebody who doesn't know who you are does make sense as a story that is also about like experiencing your own emerging celebrity.
I mean, he has a whole bit in, I can't remember, I don't know if it's Delirious or Raw, I believe it's Raw, about how he's too famous to date and he'd have to go back to Africa to find a woman. Like there's a whole like thing about it. We also have, this fictional land, Zamunda in Africa, but it's also, it really looks like India. I mean, the Akeem and Semi are sort of modeled on like these Indian princes. There's also something very European about, at least not just the set design, but how they're costumed. Like when we see them at the very beginning, they've come in from playing polo. They're wearing polo whites, which, as far as I know, is not a big sport in, Western Africa. But like all of that is kind of signaling this kind of fictional Africa, which is very much kind of like European cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, and that the trappings in that fictional Africa, like the trappings of wealth, are rendered recognizable by their proximity to like British colonialism, right?
Yeah. Someone asked me, like, can you talk about this being an inaccurate representation of Africa? And I was like, of course it's inaccurate, because the logic of Hollywood, the logic of film is that things have to be legible to the intended audience. And of course it's problematic to misrepresent Africa, but things that connote wealth and luxury in an African context, which would be quite accurate, I don't know if they read that way or or they're legible to a 1980s, American audience.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes me think of one of the pieces that sort of like really stuck out to me, which was the character of Imani, the fiance who
Vanessa Bell Calloway. Yeah.
I mean, she's wonderful. And
she's so gorgeous in this movie.
It's really interesting to read in your work about how, she becomes a sort of visual inspiration for later pop culture.
Yeah.
In some ways, sort of more than Lisa, the actual romantic partner.
Right.
Like Imani's wedding dress becomes sort of more of a touch point. Or I guess not her wedding dress, her like engagement presentation outfit.
Yeah, her intended engagement dress.
Yeah,
and the entire sequence of the engagement party. I mean, that's the scene that gets cited. Nobody, in terms of popular culture reverberations, Nobody cares about
Yeah.
the actual wedding that takes place. Nobody's copying Lisa's pink wedding dress. Like that's not the thing that stands out for people. It's Imani's dress. And I really think because that is the scene that is the most spectacular. It's giving us like old school classic Hollywood musical. Like it's that, which that's not necessarily kind of a visual language that you've often found Black people in on that level, on that kind of level of spectacle.
Yeah, yeah. And then Imani is presented and Akeem takes her, he like wants some time alone with her to like actually have a conversation with her. And then we've got this scene where he like demands that she do a series of absurd things and she does them. And one of the things that is clearly at work here in terms of what the movie is saying about love is that control is counter to real connection, right? That like the ease with which he is able to control her means that they can't have a genuine connection. But then we've got the flip side of that, of Lisa being in a really controlling relationship with Daryl.
Right.
Like Daryl essentially stages an American version of this engagement ceremony where he announces at a family event that he and Lisa are engaged without having asked Lisa first.
Right.
And that is also like Lisa rejects that in the same way that Akeem rejects being presented with Imani.
It's very much about, true love always being about free choice and individuality and people's abilities to make the choices that are best for them in their lives. And, of course, I don't want to not say that it's deeply gendered. It's like who has the ability to make choices. I mean, I got into a really kind of funny, very contentious social media debate with a friend of mine a number of years ago because I said, like at its core, I don't know that Akeem and Daryl are all that different. Like they're both rich, they're both privileged, something, which I mentioned just to say, I mean, it's very much a male fantasy of being able to choose who you want, but also that person freely choosing you for the quote unquote right reasons. I mean, I think there's a critique about there's an implicit critique about women who are gold diggers in this movie, which I think is something that Murphy was probably obviously concerned with at the time. But just as a broader thing, I don't think a woman wanting a baseline of financial stability in her life is inherently a bad thing.
No, and there's something about both Sherry Headley's performance as Lisa and also Alison Dean as Patrice, her sister. There's a scene where the earrings arrive, where Akeem has anonymously sent the earrings that are so expensive they have to be delivered by somebody accompanied by a cop. But in that scene, Patrice is talking about like there is a practical, almost sort of capitalistic exchange involved in romance. Is essentially
what she says is she says somebody's been messing around. I mean, what she's saying is you must be sleeping with somebody else who's giving you these earrings. And I have to say, I mean, I like that Patrice gets to say that. She gets to do things that are sort of quote unquote not respectable, especially for like a presentation of a Black woman in the 1980s. And like, she doesn't get punished. She just gets to be. I feel like any other movie, like I think a lot about, we're going back to the 80s, An Officer and a Gentleman, where there's two women and they're friends and one of them is, she's dating Richard Gere and the other one is kind of a gold digger and she's sleeping with his friend and, whatever. But the film makes it really clear that true love is what wins out. And if you are a good girl who does things the right way, you win out in the end. And that is a film that has to make it clear that, the kind of sexually liberated one who's like, look, I'm trying to lock this guy down because I need like a stable husband and, to get out of this small town, that's the wrong attitude. And the film has to make that really clear. So I also appreciate within a history of Hollywood films that feel the need to punish women, that we don't get that with Patrice.
Agreed. And I think that sort of leads us into some of the subtext of this movie in terms of what it's saying about, for example, gender politics. Because, going back to your point about the gendered nature of choice, it does really stand out that kind of autonomy, that ability to make choices about what your life is going to look like, does seem to be just for American women.
It's for American women, but not even entirely for American women.
Just for a few special American women.
Like, Lisa gets to choose, but I'll always just say, like, I love this film. I love it. I love it. I love it. It is not without its things worth critiquing. Like, he just lies to her the whole movie. Like, he really does. It's like a whole ruse. And then she has to sort of love him for the right reasons. Like, you've been telling this girl you are a goat herder who reads Nietzsche, like, out in the fields. This is not a relationship that's actually rooted in honesty. So it's not just choice. It's not quite the illusion of choice. It's the semblance of choice in certain ways for certain people. And again, I mean, not to do too much weird fan fiction, but I always think, like, what happens to Amani after she gets rejected?
Yes, I was thinking that too. Her whole life, she has been raised to be the bride of this prince. What's she gonna do now?
She has studied this man's likes, his dislikes. She knows everything about him. She has a PhD in Akeem, like that, you know? And then he rejects her. I assume she goes on to happiness because I need to believe that. But the film doesn't care about that. That's not its project.
It really doesn't. I mean, the film's not particularly interested in the internal life of women in general, I gotta say. One of the things that for me makes it fall a little flat as a rom-com is that we get basically no interiority from Lisa. Like, we see her with different men, and we see her with her sister. I'm kind of most interested in the scenes that's just her with her sister, because I feel like that's the closest to anything we get about her internal life. But even then, it's mostly her just like laughing and rolling her eyes at Patrice's hijinks. Yeah. But other than that, it's just, you know, we get these scenes where she does a number of sort of impassioned speeches of some variety. The first time we meet her is at the Black Awareness Rally, and she gives this serious speech about like uplifting Black community that is quite at odds with the general tone of the rally. And then, you know, we see her like standing up for herself to Daryl, or standing up for herself to her dad, or standing up for herself to Akeem. But that's kind of all we get of Lisa. So it's hard to feel one way or the other about the degree to which she loves Akeem, because I just feel like we don't get enough time with her.
I mean, I have to say that I do think that most of especially Lisa, but it's, you know, I think if you look at a number of 80s films where like the screenwriters are men and the directors are men and everybody offering any kind of creative input are men, I think that you tend to get women characters that I wouldn't go so far. She's not a trope because I think she's not a character type, but you get these women characters who in a lot of ways become mirrors or refractions of the hopes and the desires of the male characters. Yeah. And, you know, that's kind of how I look at Lisa. She, in a lot of scenes, she becomes the kind of catalyst for these interesting moments of interiority for the male characters. Like, I think there's a really sweet moment with her dad, where, you know, he's saying, like, I don't want you to have to struggle the way your mom and I did. You know, it's a really, like, it's a very sweet moment. And it gives you a lot of, I think, depth into Mr. McDowell's character, Mr. McDowell, played by John Amos. We don't really get that with her that much. We don't ever hear what she's looking for in a man. We just know that it's not Daryl. And we're not really clear how someone like Lisa exactly ended up with someone like Daryl in the first place. She seems too smart to have ever gotten with him. No shade to Eric LaSalle, but yeah.
But, you know, one of the subtexts that I had trouble putting my finger on, you know, I finished watching the movie and I thought, wow, as a rom-com, this movie's deeply uninterested in its central characters or romance.
Right.
And your work helped me understand what I was noticing. But I think one of the interesting subtexts of the way that the movie treats the A-plot as a kind of generic love story with quite minimal excitement to it, and most of the sort of comedic and visual pleasures of the film lie in these other almost sketch-like scenes.
Yes.
I think there's an interesting subtext there that suggests that, like, romantic love is less interesting than the other forms of community that actually shape the worlds that we are being immersed in here. Like, what makes Queens interesting is not ultimately the fact that he can find a Lisa there, but is like the barbershop, the Black church, the McDowells. That recurring joke that McDowell's is a knockoff of McDonald's was extremely funny to me.
It's so funny. I used McDowell as a verb the other day in my house. I was talking about something about somebody trying to like do a carbon copy. And I was like, yeah, that dude's trying to McDowell that situation. I love those little like sight gags. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it feels like romantic love is really just kind of incidental. Like it's a nice souvenir that he picks up in his adventures in America, with the exception, I will say, of like that scene where they go to dinner. That always kind of catches me off guard, where they're slow dancing to Jackie Wilson, and she looks up and she says, what about Patrice? And he's, and it's Eddie Murphy showing he can be a romantic lead. I always find that scene, like, it catches me off guard. And then we immediately cut to like kind of the funniness of him like strolling the streets, belting at the top of his lungs because he's so in love. Yeah. But yeah, I do think that it's so much more about the pleasure and the joy in community than it is about romantic love. And I would take it a step further and say, I think there's something actually quite subversive about that. I think there's something to be said about having a Black cast film that is, whether intentionally or unintentionally, rejecting that conceit of the genre that, it's kind of a love conquers all. I mean, like, it's lovely they get married in the end, but I don't know. I don't care all that much. Yeah. I care about, like their friendships that they've developed along the way.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels almost incidental at the ending, particularly when like the actual final scene of the movie is an extended cut of Eddie Murphy as Saul telling a joke. Like, the movie knows what it's most interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It knows where its bread is buttered.
Yeah. So speaking of which side the bread is buttered on, this is the moment where I am going to officially hit the emergency stop button and say that we need to talk more about formal negativity and Eddie Murphy's career. Okay, so Racquel, your book is called Double Negative, The Black Image and Popular Culture. Can you, in a nutshell, tell us what negativity is and why you think it's an important lens for thinking about Black popular culture?
Sure. So the idea of negativity stems first from kind of a popular thing that people tend to say about Black representations, which is that this is a negative representation of Black people. And that means it's a bad representation. It's setting Black people back. And I use the concept instead in a strategic way to think about, like, what are the ways that Black popular culture is doing something that is essentially different from mainstream, meaning white, popular culture? And is there a way that we can use that as a lens into thinking about kind of the cultural specificity and the subversiveness of Black film and Black television, especially things that tend to get dismissed as being uninteresting, unimportant, or pejorative?
Yeah. And, this has a lot to do with what we study in academia, like what becomes canonical, but also more generally with the way that certain films get picked up as being like iconic works of Black film and others don't. And you point out that Coming to America is often not treated in scholarship, but also in sort of general, just like film discourse. It's not treated as a Black film.
Right. And there's some interesting reasons, I think, behind that. And when I teach my courses, I teach a course called Black Film and Media, and I tend to avoid ever defining what a Black film is. And inevitably, a student will ask me, well, how are we defining a Black film?
And you're like, aha.
Aha, there you go.
And then you walk out.
Exactly. And I have a lot of problems with trying to define what a Black film is. And what I mean is, the easiest thing is to say, well, does it have a Black director? And Coming to America does not have a Black director. John Landis is a white man, who does white films for the most part. But yeah, it's there tends to be this thing where people define a Black film by the director. And I always push back on that, because I think that you measure a Black film in terms of its reverberations and in terms of its resonance. And that's a thing that you can't measure when a film premieres. That's a thing that you kind of have to wait like 20 or 30 years, I think, and see if Black folks are still talking about it. That's how I think we define a Black film. So there's that. I also think that particularly within scholarly, but also popular conversations, because Blackness has so often been kind of shoehorned into comedy and only sort of treated in comedic films or as comedic relief. I think there tends to be an understandable kind of knee-jerk reaction to that, which is to say, let's focus on Black dramas and Black people in dramatic roles. And I often think, though, that some of the most interesting stuff that's happening is happening in comedies. And so you apply both of those things to Coming to America, and it's not really surprising that it's a film that just seems to have kind of slipped off the radar of critical attention.
Yeah. And you talk about negativity in a few different ways, but when it comes to Coming to America, you're specifically talking about it in terms of formal negativity. So what in this case is the formal negativity of Coming to America?
Yeah. So when I say formal negativity, when I say form or formal, I don't mean like fanciness. I mean
not negativity like, in a tux.
I mean, black tie negativity. But what I'm talking about are sort of the conventions of film, and so form having to do with style, having to do with narrative, mise en scène, editing, casting, things like that. And so with Coming to America, I use it as an example of a formal negativity, because what I argue is that this is a film that's kind of doing everything wrong in terms of what's supposed to happen in a romantic comedy. Like in a romantic comedy, the romance is kind of like central and the main thing, and the comedy is just for kind of, it's just for relief. That is not the case in Coming to America, where I would argue the best performances really are coming in the comedic sketches. And so for me, it's like an inverse of kind of what is supposed to happen in a romantic comedy.
Yeah, and it's that inversion of the expected formal dimensions that renders that formal negativity. So So that particularly comes out in what you argue as being like almost a sort of doubled nature to the movie. So at one point you write that Murphy and Landis seem to be physically present on the same set, but working on two entirely different films.
Yeah, you watch this movie and, there's just a couple of moments, and I don't want to like discredit John Landis, but
I kind of do.
I mean, I really just want to give credit to Eddie Murphy, because I also think that there's a tendency within any discussion about film to always privilege the director. And I think that comes at the expense of kind of the amazing creative labor of performers, which has historically been where Black performers got to shine,
Yeah.
So like one of my favorite things to look at is if you look at the barbershop scenes, the barber in the first chair closest to the door, there's never anyone in his chair. It's a random kind of thing. But if you frequent Black barbershops, you know that whoever sits in the first chair is usually the worst barber in the shop. And so nobody ever wants to go to that person. And it's a really funny, like kind of like, I like to show those scenes to students and just sort of see who gets that and say, wait a minute, explain this scene to me, because he comes in, they have to wait for the other barber, but there's a barber there with an unoccupied chair. Like what's going on there? And I like to use that as a moment to say, all right, who do you think staged that? How do you think, whose idea was that? And knowing that, I believe the guy in the first chair who plays the bar, I think it's Clint Smith, who was a friend of Eddie Murphy's. He like pops up on SNL early in Eddie Murphy's career. And so like all of that kind of points to like Eddie Murphy having a larger amount, I think, of creative influence than we would typically assume an actor would.
Yeah. And that, that comes through in the way that you read Eddie Murphy playing Saul, because the story about that character that generally circulates is that it was John Landis's idea, that he knew about, the history of Jewish comedians doing blackface.
Yeah, John Landis, his story is that since Jewish comedians had always done blackface, he wanted to reverse that and have a Black comedian doing whiteface and playing this old Jewish character. And that, I mean, sure, I don't have any reason to think he's wrong, but there's a way that he takes credit for Eddie Murphy's performance that presumes that we've never seen Eddie Murphy perform before. And if you go back to SNL, like his Gumby character, like he plays Gumby like he is a Catskills comedian in the 1950s. Like that is the voice of Gumby. He'd been doing that. You know, if you listen to any interviews with Eddie Murphy, he's always citing older Jewish comedians, you know, as people who he watched and enjoyed. And so that joke, him playing Saul and him doing a joke that I believe was first popularized by Jack Benny, it's really great. I mean, it's a testament to sort of Eddie Murphy and his powers of impersonation, but also situates him within a much longer kind of lineage, not just of Black stand-up comics, but also like white Jewish comedians too.
Yeah, and he's also, you know, Eddie Murphy has cited Peter Sellers as a major influence and the reason why he likes to play multiple characters in the same movies, right? That he is engaging as a performer with a complex history of comedy. And, you know, it's such a good nugget, that sort of claim that Landis makes to being the innovator of that role and the way that actually understanding the history and the sort of performance vocabulary of Eddie Murphy as a comedian pushes back against that, which gives us insight into more generally how much power Eddie Murphy was actually bringing to this film. So can you talk just a little bit about his role in the production of Coming to America? Because we know he was this huge celebrity, but he also got this movie made. Yeah,
I mean, the stuff that I've read, and I always try to take interviews and firsthand accounts with a grain of salt. But, you know, Eddie Murphy's kind of account of things is that he's working out a deal with Paramount and he has a large amount of creative control in terms of his dealings with Paramount. Like he does The Golden Child, which is a movie that I absolutely love that was panned, that nobody else seems to like, that is Eddie Murphy as like an investigator, and there's like a Tibetan child with magical powers that he's got to like shepherd through a series of obstacles. I love this movie.
I also love that movie. I haven't thought about it in years.
But it's a movie that you see and you're like, how much power did Eddie Murphy have to be able to make?
So they're just letting him do anything, huh?
Honestly, that's what I think. I'm just, you look at it and you're like, nobody else but Eddie Murphy could be like, yeah, this is what we're doing. Yeah. And so I sort of keep that in the back of my mind, thinking about him, you know, kind of going into this deal with Paramount and making this movie. And it's also coming at an interesting point in his career where he's sort of transitioning from being the Black funny sidekick in movies like Trading Places or 48 Hours, right? Or even something like Beverly Hills Cop, and into like an actual lead. And so I always look at Coming to America as kind of like that pivot point in a film that has a foot in both worlds. You have John Landis, who had a really successful career in Hollywood and had worked with Eddie Murphy on Trading Places when Eddie Murphy was really, really young and really green. But then John Landis has this, I don't even know what to call it. I mean, he's directing the Twilight Zone movie and 2 children and an adult actor are killed in a helicopter sequence that like he wasn't supposed to be filming. He's coming out of this. He's kind of like persona non grata. He seemingly can't like get work. And the story, you know, at least as I've sort of read it and, you know, according to Eddie Murphy, is that it's Eddie Murphy who kind of uses his star power to get John Landis hired as a director. And that's sort of not how we understand sort of director-actor relationships. We think of the director as being primary. But in this case, it seems quite plausible that it's Paramount listening to Eddie Murphy. That also, I think, creates some very tense situations on set, I'd have to imagine, because it's like, well, whose movie is this now? Yeah. And if you kind of read interviews and things that were like coming off of the set around that time and subsequently, it's pretty clear that they butted heads a number of times.
Yeah. Yeah. And that comes through in the movie, the whose movie is this-ness of it.
Yeah.
We can imagine a lot of scenarios where that would kind of ruin the movie. And instead, it just makes it really interesting.
That's what makes Coming to America. Like the Black awareness rally, like what is happening at the Black awareness rally? Like so much of it is like, and they turn around and they're wearing thongs. Like what is happening? What is happening? All of the barbershop sequences, like the stuff that you know is just Eddie Murphy improvising and ad-libbing, and like the barbershop sequence where the barber is talking about getting punched by Martin Luther King Jr. on the street. Like you're just never going to tell me that a white screenwriter wrote that. I don't care what they say. Like that didn't happen. Right.
Yeah.
And so I feel like Eddie Murphy having this kind of unprecedented creative control means that this just becomes a really thoroughly Black movie.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay. Before we wrap, there's one last topic I need us to engage with, and that is right now we are talking about cross-class romance.
Okay.
And so I want to know what you think this movie says about the sort of larger category of cross-class romance.
So what I actually think this movie has to say about cross-class romance is more significant than people have given it credit for. On its surface, the film is about, okay, well, he's got a lot of money. He's like a royal, and she's like a regular, like middle-class girl from New York City. That's kind of the class difference there. But the subtext, I don't even think it's a subtext, is I do think there's this interesting tension between Africans and African Americans that comes out in the film, which, is a thing. I don't really have this isn't my area of research, but I mean, I do think that there are tensions between those communities that
the way that Daryl talks about Akeem is sort of our microcosm of that, right? That Daryl is...
Yeah, there's the way that Daryl talks about Akeem, right? Which is the kind of internalized stereotypes about Africa and, you bounce balls off your head and play with monkeys and all of that stuff, right? And there's that. But then there's the other thing, which I find really fascinating, which is King Joffrey Jaffer just thinking that Lisa is trash, thinking that she and her family are trash. I mean, they're like a middle-class family with, a nice house and like that cute little train that runs around the bar. Like he owns a business. There's no economic justification for King Joffrey Jaffer thinking that, except kind of an internalized, inherent anti-Blackness, which I think is very much a thing.
Yeah, and an sort of anti-diaspora attitude, right? Like that, that's part of the complexity of diasporic politics.
Yeah. And I just think that, films, not like popular comedic films, I don't think they always get into those kind of like nitty gritty complexities, of tensions among like the African diaspora.
The other thing that for me that really comes through in the way that Eddie Murphy performs Akeem particularly is that there is this sense of like, he is so self-possessed no matter what happens to him. He's so gracious. He's so humble.
Yeah.
He doesn't feel belittled by living this life in the way that Semi does. Like,
right.
But when called upon to be a hero, when Samuel L. Jackson holds up the McDowells, the reference that he does it several times a week. They're like, oh my God, that guy comes in here and robs this place.
Right.
Several times a week is, again, so funny. But like, there's this sense that like, well, being a prince just makes you a better person.
Yeah, no, it's true. I also think of it in terms of he's also secure in a way that Semi isn't secure. Like, because Akeem can play at being poor. I don't know Semi's financial situation. Semi's like, what, are you out of your mind? Why? Like, if I screw this up, I'm going to end up with Amani, like outcast from the kingdom someday. Yeah. Right? But I'd also say that I think, I think there's a bit of a tension, like an African-American tension in the film. I also think Akeem his character is kind of a model minority character. I mean, that's the other thing, that he is going to be gracious and humble and he enjoys hard work, right? And there's a way that Semi is kind of treated as like, almost like a bad Black stereotype, not entirely, but he wants it for nothing. He just wants to lay around, right? Like all of that. And so I feel like those tensions and those kind of discourses, which would be very much present in the 1980s if we're thinking about socially, politically, Republicans saying we have to cut, social services because there's all these lazy Black women who are just taking advantage of welfare. Like that, all of that is kind of like in the atmosphere at the time this movie is getting made.
Yeah. And it's being critiqued by the movie, right? The idea that you work your way up from the bottom is really critiqued in that scene where, the other employee at the McDowell's is like... Louis Anderson, is like, well, I used to empty the garbages, but now I'm on fry duty and soon I'll be... Right. And then just another 8 years and I'll be assistant manager.
That's right.
But the moment that really stood out to me is Semi and Akeem arrive. They are pretending that they are students. They go into this apartment building and are like, hello, please give us your absolute worst apartment. We want it to be disgusting.
Yes.
Which does seem to me to be like a pretty clear commentary on the way that like Black students are treated when they go to America to study abroad. It's like, you're here. You must want to live in a hovel.
Right.
Right this way.
I mean, it's also, though, I like that reading. I agree with that reading. But there's also the way that scene plays for me is it's also just so indicative of a particular type of privilege that I think regular Black folks cannot identify with. I almost see it as like if you gone to college with those like really, really wealthy, usually white kids, and they're like, I'm going to go like backpack with nothing and I'm just going to live off the, like the privilege and being able to rough it is that too. Yeah.
Okay, Racquel, complete the sentence for me. You should watch this movie if...
You should watch this movie if you like culturally specific Black comedy. If you enjoy Eddie Murphy, if you enjoy Black performers, you should watch this movie if you like something like Singin' in the Rain, which is a film which is all about the kind of vignettes and has a little bit of a snarky tone towards its A-plot.
Yeah. Oh my God, totally. Like, I'm such a fan of that era of vaudeville-inspired musical comedies, and this really scratches the same itch. I'm going to say you should watch this movie if you want to find out the origin of about 100 jokes that you've always known but didn't know where they were from, such as sexual chocolate. Incredible. All right. So next week, you are going to hear me and Racquel talk about the final scene of Coming to America. And if you want to hear Vanessa and I talk about the scene where Akeem sees Lisa for the first time at the Black Awareness Rally, then you should subscribe to our Patreon.
Hi, everyone. This is your trusty producer, Ariana Nettleman. When we were thinking about who to reach out to for the end of episode conversation, one person came to mind for me, and I'll think you agree she's a great get. Vanessa Zoltan was out this week. She was too sick to come to our recording, but she still has a lot to say about Coming to America, so I'm going to give her a call. Hi, Vanessa.
Hello, Ariana, is it?
Oh, yeah. Hi. I'm sorry I never call you, so you must not have my number in your phone.
Yeah, it's such an honor to meet you. I like that we checked the expert box on this episode with Racquel.
We don't need to call a scholar. The scholar did the whole episode.
We had 2 scholars on the whole show. So let's call Riff Raff.
What else do you need, people?
They need a representative of the hoi polloi, and that is why I'm here.
Well, you were actually the person who chose Coming to America to do for this season. So what made you excited to talk about this movie?
It's a movie I was raised watching. It was like a favorite movie of my dad. And so I watched it a lot as a kid, and I thought it was really, really funny. And I think also as a child of immigrants, this idea that you come to America to make your future is like one that I was raised with. And this movie, to some extent, is the opposite. It's a rich person coming to America for a person, not someone coming to the United States for economic gain.
Yeah.
And so just thinking about it as an adult, my parents felt very fish out of water in where we grew up. People were trying to constantly guess the ethnicity of my parents. And so I think as a kid, I was like, yes, I understand what it's like to be noticeably not from here. So I wanted to rewatch it as an adult just because I hadn't.
Yeah, something Racquel briefly mentioned, but she and Hannah didn't really dig into, is this tension in the film between Black Americans and the Africans coming over.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm just wondering if that's something that resonated with you, because I know we've talked a lot about what it means to be like an immigrant Jew versus an American Jew.
Yeah, I think that I'm married to a European non-Jew, and I think that he and I have more in common culturally than I often do with American Jews. Like, I walked into his apartment for the first time when we first started dating, and it looked like every family member I ever had, like their apartment, and right, like the foods that we eat are the same, and just like a lot of his cultural references and my family's cultural references were the same. And then, of course, right, just like with any intersectionality, there are absolutely things with American Jews that I'm like, you and I are the same in this way. And I was, raised as an American Jew. But there is something, you've been witness to me connecting with a mutual friend of ours, Michaela Bly, who is a Hungarian Jew with 4 grandparents who are Holocaust survivors, and finding someone with the exact same identity as you is such an exciting thing. And then finding these intersectional, like, oh, you are similar to me in this way, and you are similar to me in that way, right? Like meeting someone who's the exact same age as you and therefore watch the exact same sitcoms as you. There are all these different ways that we can relate to people.
So what do you think the difference between Lisa and Prince Akeem does for the movie in terms of what it's saying about love? Because you didn't get to answer the question
yes, what is
in the main episode. What is this movie saying about love, Vanessa?
One of the things that I love that the movie is saying is that even if you are acculturated entirely in a point of view, you can liberate yourself from that point of view, which is what Akeem does, right? He was raised that like a wife should be nothing but subservient to him. And he's like, this is ridiculous. I don't actually want to be like that. And I was raised with very specific ideas about marriage and that we separate from our families. And I really love that is so beautifully rendered. He just like wants someone who's an equal. I just think there are some people who feel called to leave where they are from to find out who they are. I'm one of 7 grandchildren. All 6 of my cousins live in LA and I live 3,000 miles away. And so I think that's part of why this movie sort of sparkles at me. Like, what is it that you're like, no, I need to cross the world in order to figure out who I am?
Yeah. I think one of the questions Racquel is asking in her wonderful chapter and in this episode is like, is the love story what we find interesting about this movie? And do you have a take on that? Like, do you remember watching this being like, these two, I'm so happy they're together? Or was it something else for you when you were younger?
When I was a kid, I really did care about the love story, and I was absolutely convinced that was the plot of the movie. And then rewatching it, I was like, oh, this is a sketch comedy series that is like loosely strung together with this sort of tepid romance. And I was mostly embarrassed because it was my idea that we watch the movie. And I was like, oh no, I remembered this as more of a love story. And I did not find it super satisfying to watch this movie again. But I will say, for like a coat hanger of a plot, it is a compelling coat hanger. It's like more than simply perfunctory.
Yeah, and something that I've been thinking about as we've been watching all these romance movies is who is the gaze pointing towards in terms of desire? Like, are we supposed to be looking at the woman in this film thinking, wow, I really want to kiss her, date her, be her, or are we looking at the man? And what's so wonderful in many rom-coms is like they're focused on the man, on female desire. And this movie, which is created by a male director, by Eddie Murphy, who had this huge hand in it, I think is still a movie in which we look at Prince Akeem, who is so virtuous, has so much integrity, and we think like, ooh, I want that kind of guy. That's an exciting person to fall in love with. So for me, I think there is something that sparkles about the love plot in there.
Yeah. No, they're both people who are concerned about being good. And I know you've heard me say this a lot, but my favorite kind of art is good people trying to be good in a complicated world or in a bad world. And those are definitely 2 people who are trying to be good in a complicated world. And that is definitely my favorite vibe. Especially, he has this like Jesus-like quality to him, right? Where he's constantly just giving things away and has like no attachment to material belongings. And like, I'll say it, he's hot. Eddie Murphy is also not afraid to like use his body as an object of desire.
Yeah. Okay, I have one more question for you.
Yes.
So we spent 10 episodes talking about how to lose a guy in 10 days.
Yes.
A movie where famously 2 characters are lying to each other the whole time.
Yeah.
And here we have another movie where our main character is lying about who he is to get someone to fall in love with him.
Yeah.
How do you feel about it?
I think that we are supposed to feel like it's okay to lie if the lie that you're withholding is good news, right? As far as impact. It's cruel to tell a child, I'm giving you a puppy, and then not give them a puppy. But saying, I'm not getting you a puppy for your birthday, don't even think about it, and then knowing that you're giving them a puppy, like, we're all vaguely okay with that kind of lie. And I think that we're supposed to see wealth just as this, like, piece of good news, and therefore it's like the puppy that we weren't expecting. And I understand her sense of betrayal that he's been lying to her, because that is a huge thing to hide, especially because he's not just rich, he's a royal. And so marrying him comes with a job for her. The other thing I'll say is just, it's really understandable, and I think that we've seen this represented in film and movies, and I'm sure it's true all over the place, that when there is something like that is an attractive signifier about you, wanting somebody to fall in love for, like, quote unquote, who you really are is an appealing idea, right? This is the premise of Love is Blind. Like, you want people to love you for who you are and not for your wealth or your fame or your status or what you look like. So of course it's a lie, but I do think it's a more socially acceptable lie.
Okay, Vanessa, I'm so glad that we were able to get your voice on this episode. Do you want to do the credits while you're here?
I would love to. You've been listening to Hot and Bothered. We are a small show, so we need and really appreciate your support to run. If you can, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/hotandbotheredrompod. If you love the show, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We are a Not Sorry production. Our executive producer is me, Vanessa Zoltan, and we are edited and produced by Ariana Nettleman. We are distributed by Acast. Thanks as always to our soulmate level patrons, Molly Reilly, who we would chase through an airport to declare our love to, Becky Boo, who we would wait for hours on the top of the Empire State Building for, Elizabeth Schweinsberg, whose heart we would play a game of one-on-one basketball for, and Lauren Bayer O'Connell, who we would call up on stage to dance with us in front of the whole summer camp. And thanks to our wonderful team, Julia Argy, Nikki Zoltan, AJ Aramas, Courtney Brown, and Stephanie Paulsell. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.